Tonight on Need to Know, an effort to boost safety in schools around the country is now a topic of national debate. Why some say facial recognition technology won't work and will lead to consequences for kids. That story is next. Also on the show, if these gloomy winter months are dragging you down mentally and emotionally, you are not alone. Seasonal depression is real. Why it happens and how to cope later on the show. And it's a major initiative promising to end poverty by 50% by 2025, backtracking on that promise. A new WXXI series explains. Don't go anywhere. Need to Know starts right now. A Western New York school district made national headlines when it shared a plan intended to provide heightened security for students. In the aftermath of a record number of school shootings in 2018, U.S. schools are working to be proactive to better protect students. For the Lockport City School District and others throughout the country, facial recognition technology could be a solution. While some say this technology will make schools more secure, critics believe it will negatively influence school climate, among other issues. Joining me to discuss more is attorney Scott Maloof and director of the New York City Civil Liberties Union, Genesee Valley Chapter, Iman Abid. And welcome to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So let me first tell you how difficult it has been for me to track down a school or a school official in our region willing to talk about this. So I reached out to Lockport City Schools, never heard back. I reached out to the city school district. They made their chief operating officer available. And then they later said, you know what? We don't want to be involved in the interview. Then the Monroe County School Boards Association president never responded to our email. So I'm going to give this to you first, Scott. Why are schools avoiding me? Why do schools not want to talk about this?
Well, assuming it's not you,
Right.
I think a lot of it is because when you really start to parse through this data is very sensitive. And I was thinking about it on the way here. You know, if I dropped your home address, on a piece of paper in the street, not that big a deal. If I dropped your resume, it's even a bigger deal because now it's your work history and your home address. But if I dropped your diary with your name in it, that's your most personal stuff, and you'd be really irritated. I think on this, the scale of irritation and sensitivity, this technology, particularly with students, is closer to that diary than it is to the address. And so that's why a lot of people, when they think it through, say, we got to be very careful and maybe we don't want to take a public position, because if we're going to use it for safety, we start to recognize how sensitive it is.
So how does it work? So for the viewers who are like, facial recognition technology, what exactly is happening with this software, this technology?
Right. If you think about the technology, if I see you as myself, or if I see Iman, I recognize you. I know you, I've seen you and met you. Computers don't work that way. So the technology uses landmarks on our face. We have about 80 of them, and it measures them. So say the distance between my eyes, the curvature on my nose, something like that. And so it then puts a map together. So Helen, you have a unique map of your face. Mm-hmm. I have one, Iman has one. Mm-hmm. And so that is then used as against video technologies, against images. And it says, okay, is the image that I'm seeing an equal to this map? And again, that's why it's so sensitive. It's not just a picture of me, it's a measure of who I am, and I can't change my face, barring surgery, and even then that may not change it. So that's why I think there's a lot of concern in how it works.
All right, let me ask you this. So Iman, in terms of the New York Civil Liberties Union, when Lockport went public and said, hey, we got this $4 million in state funding and we plan to use it for facial recognition technology, the New York Civil Liberties Union spoke out and said they actually asked the state legislature to put a ban on allowing this technology in schools. So explain why. What are the major concerns?
Yeah, I think it started off with a concerned parent that actually reached out to our office and let us know that this technology was being spoken about at the school district and that they were interested in finding out more information and actually also stopping the program itself. And so that's back in June of 2018, we sent out a letter to the Lockport School District as well as the Department of Education and asked them to actually put a halt on the program until more information was being released. And so dating back to, I believe, 2016, when the conversation began and the Smart Schools Bond Act actually came out with this, funding for each of the school districts across New York State, we started talking to the school district about, what sorts of process was actually put into place to educate people on the issue and what was actually about to happen. I mean, when we're talking about surveillance technology that's being used, the scope of information that's being stored on this piece of technology is tremendous. And in many cases, like drones, if we're talking about metal detectors, whatever it may be, and especially around young individuals, like anyone from K through 12, we have to be incredibly careful about what it is that we're actually implementing and what sorts of information we're actually storing. On minors, number one, basically around their own confidentiality, making sure that the parents are aware of what sort of technology is actually being used and making sure that the products are actually just as transparent as anyone says that they should be. But especially when it comes to facial recognition, we needed to put a stop on it unless we first saw the policy itself and understood the scope of what it was going to be used for.
So what can go wrong, I guess, with just this technology? I've read misidentification is one big thing. So let's say, and parents and students have been misidentified in schools that use this technology right now, but what happens when someone's misidentified? How damaging is that?
Well, I'll pick that up real quick. One of the big things is it depends on what the school does. When a vendor sells the technology, they may say, "Oh, this is saving you a lot of work, and everything will go, really smoothly." But the challenge comes in when you get that positive hit, right? What do you do next? If you are screening for sex offenders, against the registry, you put in a place of process. This person can't access the school. They've got to have someone that comes with them. So that's the real challenge: is what does come next? Because how are you using it? And so once you have false positives, it creates a big problem. Secondarily, you got some technologies being suggested saying, someone will not buzz you in. The system will buzz you in. And so even if you've got an error rate of only 2 or 3%, you can see in a day where maybe 100 people do come to a school, 3 people saying, "I'm not getting in." Now there's a problem. And then finally, another problem that we haven't talked about is, data breach. If this data is lost or somehow, exfiltrated because the school has been hacked, then what happens to that stuff, both the still images and that map of the face?
I want to share something with you both. The Electronic Frontier Foundation released a detailed report saying this technology misidentifies African Americans and ethnic minorities, young people and women at higher rates than whites, older people, and men. And the EFF also stated that, we've got a graphic for our viewers so they can see this, due to years of well-documented racially biased police practices, all criminal databases, including mugshot databases, include a disproportionate number of African Americans, Latinos, and immigrants. Iman, Scott mentioned false positives. When we have false positives in terms of things such as race, misidentification, what can happen?
I mean, what ends up happening is we're enforcing a policy on a specific group of people. We're only looking at those individuals, and the algorithms that are actually used to develop this facial recognition technology, whether it's used by the police department or schools or other sorts of institutions, have generally been incredibly racist. And so, I mean, when we're talking again about minors, then now we're also reinforcing this against minors who are of color. And we already see racial disparities when we're talking about any sorts of technology being used to criminalize these students, whether, again, it's metal detectors that we even see here at the Rochester City School District, if it's body-worn cameras that are being used by police officers that are in the school district, and the possibility of using facial recognition technology that would then, again, create these, would expand on these racial disparities that would make people of color, especially students of color, feel incredibly unsafe. I think I just want to acknowledge one of the things, but the technology itself would actually also develop what's called an unwanted list, unwanted persons list, and that list itself, we have no idea, number one, who's actually on it, where is it coming from, and if we're talking about the historic usage of, sorts of databases where we're using the same old algorithms that, again, have been incredibly racially biased, then we're using the same system to be enforced in the school district. And so those people of color, students of color, parents of color may not be welcome into the building based on these false algorithms that, again, are just incredibly racially biased.
I want to go back to privacy for just a second, because Scott, something that we've talked about before on the show comes down to social media. I mean, anytime you go, and we live in a social media era, you click create an account. When you do that on a social media platform, essentially, talking about privacy, you're sharing a part of yourself with the world. Kids of all ages are on social media. So is that a realistic argument, or is it much more, since they're already putting their stuff out there as it is, I guess much more concerning is it when it comes to privacy?
Well, I mean, the best practices with any kind of technology, particularly something like a facial recognition or thumb scans, things like that, is opt-in. I should have a choice. Do I wish to participate or not? In a school setting, I don't have that option. Children have to go to school, be it this school or a private school or homeschool. So you're losing opt-in. So that's one big issue. Second, it's, again, the comprehensiveness of this. There are plenty of people who've said, I'm not going to use Facebook, I'm going to drop out of Instagram. You and I have talked about these issues. But when it comes to this technology, you don't have that choice. So it's a real problem. And again, I go back to the data breach, the training. If the school loses this, or the the facial analysis is actually done someplace else, and that company loses your data, you've not opted in.
We could spend much more time on this, but unfortunately we have to close. So I want to thank my guests for joining me and for sharing your perspectives on this issue. And to our viewers, in particular those with students in K-12 schools or affiliated with the public education system, we want to hear from you. Is facial recognition technology a yay or a nay, and why? Reach out to me on Twitter and tell me your thoughts. If the recent polar vortex has you questioning why you still live in Western New York, or if the gloomy winter weather in general has you feeling less than upbeat, don't worry, you are not alone. You may be dealing with a common issue known as seasonal affective disorder. It saps your energy and might be the reason you're craving more sleep or having a hard time focusing on specific tasks. Why does this happen, and how can we combat these symptoms? Dr. Joshua Wartzel of UR Medicine Mental Health and Wellness joins me to answer those questions and more. And welcome. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
So for some, this may be a very new term, seasonal affective disorder. So if you can break it down, what is it? How does it happen?
Sure. So seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, S-A-D, is a very common form of depression that occurs in the fall and winter and should subside by the spring and the summer. If it doesn't, we start to think about it being a different type of depression. And it looks very much like other depressions. People will be sadder, feel worthless, guilty. They'll note changes in their appetite, usually increased appetite, changes in their sleep, increased sleep. They'll also often comment on lower energy and concentration.
So do we know why this happens in this particular span of months that you mentioned?
Definitely. So seasonal affective disorder is more or less a disease of circadian rhythm. And so when there's less light out there, your body is not necessarily able to know when it should be awake and go to sleep. So we've evolved to start releasing a chemical called melatonin right when it starts to get dark outside, and then to turn that chemical down when it starts to get bright. But in these extreme latitudes, like here in our neck of the woods, that melatonin is dysregulated. So basically that's one part of it. The other part of it is there's another chemical called serotonin, a neurotransmitter that's relevant.
So for the symptoms that you mentioned, do people experiencing seasonal affective disorder, will they experience all of those symptoms, or could it be just a few of them?
Could be just a few. The most common for sure seen in the majority are feelings of sadness. Around 60 to 70% will note changes in their appetite and sleep. But then there's a whole slew of different things that can be seen as well.
So I'm curious as to whether there are certain people who are more susceptible to the symptoms, or if there are people who aren't. They would likely avoid something such as this. Like, would someone who is already suffering from major depression, would this be something that be a natural thing to take place?
That's a great question. So first off, it's more common in women, 3 times more common in women. It also starts usually in the 20s to 30s, although can be seen later in life as well. It's usually just when it starts. In terms of whether or not people can be more or less susceptible if they have other mental illness, actually I was just involved with a study where we showed that all different types of psychiatric illness that are regulated by serotonin show an increased prevalence when you're in regions of lower light and lower temperature.
That's interesting, because it makes me think. I have family in Florida, and I tell people they like to send me photographs of walks on the beach when I'm in the grocery store grabbing milk and bread and preparing for a snowstorm. And I'm wondering, is this something that could affect them or someone who lives in another sunny state or city more so than it affects us here in Western New York?
Sure, and it can. Actually, the prevalence of SAD is around 4% down in Florida. It's around 20%, unfortunately, up in our neck of the woods. I believe that statistic was for New Hampshire.
So talk to me just a little bit about the types of things that people can do to re-energize themselves. The types of things they can do. You mentioned feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness. What can we do to beat this?
Definitely. So sometimes people will self-treat, maybe unwittingly, by eating more carb-rich foods. So you mentioned eating bread. This is actually a building block for serotonin. So you will feel somewhat better from it, but there's the side effect of gaining weight. So I wouldn't recommend it. It's okay, you can sleep good. But exercise is a wonderful approach, non-medicinally, to improving your serotonin function.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's other medicines and treatments as well that we offer.
So is this, I guess, based on that, medicines and treatments, is seasonal affective disorder something that a doctor it's something that can be diagnosed, or is it something that people generally tend to self-diagnose?
Many people may first self-diagnose it, and they'll go to their primary care doctor and note that they're depressed in the winter. And both primary care doctors and psychiatrists will treat it.
So I'm curious as to whether, we're talking about, with SAD, just a case of the winter blues that we so often hear, people describe, especially here in Western New York, or if this is something that people really need to pay attention to if they notice some of the symptoms that you mentioned, and they also notice that they don't go away.
For sure. So definitely for those who have noticed this perhaps over a winter or two, I recommend them seeking help. And we have multiple treatments such as light therapy, pretty benign. It's shown to be very effective in 2/3 of our patients. And it's something very simple to do. You would just have a light box that you would use while eating breakfast or reading in the morning for around half an hour. And so it's really not much of an intervention. If there's concern that the symptoms do persist outside of the winter months, then definitely there are other diagnoses that you could consider, other types of depression.
The light box is interesting. I've never thought about something like that being able to impact mood. But are there, in terms of are there like home remedies? I know you mentioned exercise. Are there other things that you would suggest that can help people feel a bit better?
Sure. Melatonin is actually a medicine that you can get in the pharmacy over the counter. Some patients will benefit from a very low dose of melatonin in the mornings. Or actually I should say a little after the morning. If you take 0.125 milligrams around 7 hours after waking up, so if you're waking up around 9, then you take it at 4, that pushes your sleep cycle up forward so that there's some improvement in around 2/3 of patients. There's other medicines we can prescribe as well.
That's interesting. I always think of melatonin as something that I take before I'm going to bed, as opposed to a little bit midway through the day. So for people who are hearing this conversation right now and they're thinking, you know what, some of those symptoms sound familiar to me, but I can deal with it. We've got just a few more months left, of the winter, and I can make it through. What would you suggest to them? Or I guess I should first ask, what can happen if you don't address symptoms such as this? Can it affect your everyday life?
Oh, for sure. Some patients who are depressed will sleep more. It might affect their work, certainly their productivity and their happiness. And I would encourage anyone who's feeling those symptoms to come.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time, but a special thank you to Dr. Joshua Wartzel for your insight. And you can learn more about seasonal affective disorder and how to get help. Go to our website, wxxinews.org, and click on the Need to Know link. Well, it is hard to believe it's been 4 years since we first reported on a first-of-its-kind initiative that launched in Rochester with much political fanfare. The Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, or RMAPI, which is backed by the governor's office, promised to reduce poverty by 50% in 15 years. WXXI's Veronica Volk recently dug into the initiative to find out if the promises initially made are being kept and to learn what's changed since that major announcement in 2015. I recently sat down with Veronica to discuss her findings, and you can take a look. Veronica, there have been questions in our community in regards to the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative about is this initiative working? Is it working fast enough? And B, how transparent has it been? Has it been communicating with the community in terms of its efforts? And I'm curious as to whether those two factors at all tied into your decision to pursue this story in more depth.
Absolutely, it was those two factors. I mean, I covered the announcement of the original Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative 4 years ago, and I think, like a lot of people in the media, I was struck by their initial promise of reducing poverty by 50% in 15 years. So I figured it's been 4 years, let's check in, let's see what they've done, and let's see if they're any more towards that goal. Well, we also got a poverty report in September of last year that showed that poverty has actually been increasing in the city. It's a very small increase, but I was wondering how this, new announcement had affected their overall plan and whether or not they were still on track to make that original goal. So that's what I was looking to find out.
So right now, based on that report, we are the third poorest metropolitan area in the country. So based on that, this goal, which was by 2025, we were going to reduce poverty by 50%. Is that still the major focus, or has that changed slightly?
Well, when I spoke with Leonard Brock, he said we should not lose sight of that goal, we being a city. He's not just talking about the Anti-Poverty Initiative, he's talking about city government, nonprofit, state government. And he said he called it an aspirational goal. But in that way, I think he was also kind of distancing the initiative from that as a benchmark that was actually going to determine whether or not they were being successful in reducing poverty at all. So in calling it an aspirational goal, he said we shouldn't lose sight of the overall picture that we want to reduce poverty, but we also shouldn't hold ourselves to that very specific standard, because it would be something that has never been done before in a city like Rochester. And what he said was, any kind of progress would be a good step in the right direction. But at this point, it's hard to know what progress would be considered successful. Is it any reduction in poverty whatsoever? Or is there any sort of benchmark that we can look at and say, the poverty initiative is working? And so far, it doesn't seem like we have an answer to that.
So let me ask you this. So based on what you just said, you're thinking that, or based on your reporting so far, there are no specific benchmarks that they're aiming towards, just aspirational goals? Or are there specific things that they're trying to target?
Well, I know that from my conversations with Leonard Brock, he said that he's looking more at a city like Hartford, Connecticut, where they were able to reduce poverty by 10% in the same time frame. So 10% is not 50%, of course, but it would still be a really dramatic shift. And I think that he himself is looking at like more that 10% goal than a 50% goal, but they have not set a specific goal for themselves. And I think in a big way it's because they don't want to set unreasonable expectations again, like they might have been doing back in 2015.
Okay. In terms of misunderstandings that you discovered in your reporting, what are those misunderstandings in relation to this initiative?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because I walked into this project with some serious misunderstandings. I think, like a lot of people in the community, and that has to do with their, lack of kind of specific messaging with this poverty initiative. What is it? A lot of people think it's to provide direct services. It's not. A lot of people think it's a funder. It's not. A lot of people think it's an agency. It's not. And what they describe themselves as is sort of this coordinator between all the institutions in Rochester and Monroe County that are supposed to be working towards any sort of poverty reduction, but also job creation, development. So they see themselves as kind of a liaison between these organizations and making sure that everybody's on track and everybody's kind of working towards the same goal of poverty reduction.
You reported on this early on with the initiative. They broke into groups to address what are the issues that we're dealing with,
Yeah, that's right.
and how can we resolve some of these issues. For Need to Know, we did a poverty simulation a few years ago, and after the simulation, I interviewed someone from Syracuse who said, and she's involved in anti-poverty work there, she said, in so many words, if we're going to have change, you have got to have people at the table who live in poverty, are dealing with this every day, and are able to add to the discussion and also talk about some things to bring change. Is that effectively happening? Did that effectively happen with this initiative?
I think that was one of the big pillars behind our mapping in the beginning, was this idea that we're going to include people who live in poverty in the conversation. We're going to set our goals based on what people need and what people who are working through the system say their problems are. So in the beginning, there was a lot of that. They broke out into work groups where they were working towards recommendations to solve problems in housing and transportation, in job creation and public safety. They also did, one-on-one interviews with people in the community. They did surveys, but right now it's kind of unclear where all that information went. I spoke with one woman who was in a working group. She was a member of the community. She came from poverty. She worked towards a lot of recommendations in the area of housing that she never saw come to fruition. So you have to wonder whether or not those recommendations have actually been informing some of the work that our MAPI does.
So is
one
there a
of the-
communication issue? I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there a communication issue then, just in terms of
It's-
how, with things that have already taken place
Right.
and the reporting back to either the people that have been involved in this work, those initial groups, or the community, is there a lack of communication so people understand?
I think that comes down to the lack of understanding of what our MAPI is and what it has become in the last 4 years. In the beginning, I think there was a misunderstanding about what they were going to do with all this information that they were compiling from people living in poverty. And at this point, there seems to be a lack of accountability in making those things happen. Our MAPI has gathered all this information. They have awesome recommendations. They have all this, data and information from people living in poverty. Now, who is going to pick that up and carry it forward? Now, our MAPI would say it's the jobs of nonprofits and our city government and, our state government and funders and private entities. But I think that's where the breakdown is in communication of who's supposed to be responsible for carrying the torch forward.
Got it. So do we have anything in place today that we didn't have before this initiative even began, that we can say this is something that's happening because of the work that's been done so far?
There are some specific programs in place that our MAPI advocated for in the beginning of kind of its run. And those are, things like adult mentorship programs, early childhood education programs that were kind of the basis of why our MAPI was created in the first place. How do we make sure that we're all working towards poverty reduction in the city? And our MAPI sees itself as kind of like an advocate for a lot of these programs. It doesn't directly fund them, it doesn't directly oversee them, but it is, in an interesting way, going to be using some of the data that's collected from these programs. For instance, there's an adult mentorship program called Bridges to Success, and they're right now working one-on-one with people. You have a mentor and a mentee trying to help them reach personal goals to, rise above their circumstances currently. If you wanted to raise poverty in Rochester by 50%, you would have to help 50,000 individuals, right? So working with people one-on-one isn't necessarily a strategy to raise the community up as a whole, but they are getting a lot of information from these sessions about how to streamline service delivery for people. How do you create a one-stop shop for somebody who needs help with all of these different things? Maybe they need access to transportation. Maybe they're having trouble, paying their mortgage or paying their rent. How do you make sure that they can walk into one door and receive access to all the different services available through them, whether it's like through a city program or through a nonprofit agency or something like that. So they're looking at big picture, but using these programs as kind of a way to explore that.
Check out the 3-part radio news series on the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative by WXXI's Veronica Volk on our website. Just go to WXXInews.org. And that wraps up another edition of Need to Know, Rochester's news magazine. I'm your host, Helen Bianduti-Hofer. Thank you for joining me tonight and throughout the weekend here on WXXI TV. Have a great night, and I'll see you next week.